The number of people that are losing their jobs is staggering. I run into friends who are saying, how am I going to pay my mortgage?
Can I just ask you, first of all, just for your thoughts on this day of talks with, the American administration talking to the Russian foreign minister about normalizing relations, including economic relations, and setting up these negotiating teams without Ukraine or European leaders having any say?
Everybody's running around with their hair on fire. I actually think it's a good idea for American diplomats and Russian diplomats to sit down at the table and talk face to face. This should have happened years ago.
Yeah.
And so I don't have a problem with that. What I want to see next is that the Trump administration goes to the Ukrainians, goes to the Europeans, and has a full board discussion about what went on in Riyadh and about what the plans are for bringing a war to an end. And I also don't understand why the Trump administration gave away so much before the Russians have even talked about stopping the killing. They talked about economic normalization, no NATO membership, no U.S. boots on the ground. All that stuff should be part of a deal, not put out at the top.
Right. I mean, can you give me any kind of, educated guess or theory or just wild guess as to why that might be the case?
My best guess is that they don't really know what they're doing. They have impulses. I think the impulses are positive in the sense that this is not a war that Ukraine is going to win, and so we need to try to stop it sooner rather than later. But, Rubio hasn't really spent much time as a negotiator. Stephen Witkoff is a businessman. Michael Waltz, who was there, doesn't have much experience. I think that they're shooting from the hip, and that's why they're making rookie mistakes.
Yeah. Now, what about this this deal, which seems to be on the table from the American side, for extensive mineral rights in exchange for security guarantees for Ukraine? I've been discussing some pretty heavy criticism of that. The steep price being demanded of Ukraine. It is also true, isn't it? Just address this for me, that America, it would likely get those mineral rights, and that could help break the stranglehold of China on the supply of these vital and rare minerals.
It's okay to be transactional. It's not okay to look like you're extorting Ukraine, and I fear that it looks like they're extorting Ukraine. And also, listen, Ukraine is barely making it through the day. The Russians are continuing to pummel their infrastructure, pummel their industry, pummel their energy grid. And the idea that somehow the United States should be compensated for everything it's doing at a time when we're going to have to spend a massive amount of money on reconstruction doesn't make a lot of sense. And so whereas I understand the Trump administration's desire to talk to the Russians, this piece of it strikes me as really off tone.
Interesting. Look, from where we sit, Charles, these are events and developments happening so rapidly of global significance and of direct importance to us. How is this playing in America? How big is it on the radar of the public?
I just came back from Munich, where I was at the security conference. I listened to Vance's speech, listened to Zelensky's speech. And frankly, I kind of felt like I'm coming home from a funeral because it was that bad. And as you know, because you're in Europe, Europeans are at a bit of a loss. And Macron called this emergency meeting in Paris yesterday to talk about what do we do now. In the United States, I would say there is some focus on this, but a lot more on day-to-day issues. I live in Washington. The number of people that are losing their jobs is staggering. I run into friends who are saying, how am I going to pay my mortgage? Because they're all federal employees and they're getting sacked. And so right now, a lot of this is on the situation here in the United States, the inappropriate tampering of the judicial system by the politicos. So there isn't quite the same obsession with what's going on in Ukraine as there is in Europe.
Well, I mean, you set out a litany of turbulent events happening right now in America, but I think I look at opinion polls that tell me that the Trump administration, still has pretty broad approval among American voters. Isn't that the case?
Yes, although the numbers are starting to trend down, not in a way that in some ways threatens Trump or would suggest he's going to change course, but I do think he has to keep an eye on how disruptive his initial month in office is for many Americans of different walks of life. And I do think that if he proceeds with the tariffs, if he proceeds on a daily basis with more and more disruption, his poll numbers are going to keep going down. His voter base is going to be going to Walmart and other stores, and they're going to see prices go up and inflation go up, and it's not going to do anything for their quality of life. So exactly where Trump is heading on these fronts, nobody knows.
Well, I guess we can all agree on that. Interesting perspective. Charles Kupchan, who was a senior director in the National Security Council of the Obama administration. Thank you for joining us. Now, let me first now welcome Larissa Brown, the defense editor at The Times. Hello to you, Larissa.
Good evening.
Good to see you. Thank you for coming in. But look, against all of this, it's worth just pointing out, isn't it, that while the momentum may be building for some kind of peace deal, maybe on terms pleasing to Vladimir Putin, fact is that Russia needs a peace deal too. They've suffered heavy losses and paid a good deal by way of economic costs.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, they've still got people that they can deploy to the front line, but they're losing tens of thousands of people very frequently, and they can't go on for too long. And I think also the big problem is that yes, the economy is suffering, and Putin obviously sees this as a big opportunity. And of course, let's not forget that people haven't gone to the negotiating table previously because they don't trust Putin. Now, the fact that Trump's willing to do this is actually a huge win for Putin, because realistically, anything we see from him probably isn't going to be very trustworthy.
And you can see why the Russian leadership, Vladimir Putin and his team, are just grabbing this opportunity from America with both hands. Can I just ask your thoughts as an expert in the field, your thoughts on this possible peacekeeping force as you look at it, as you look at the way European leaders were rather split in Paris yesterday? Does this look like a credible idea? Does it look like the makings of a serious deterrent?
Well, these splits were emerging a few weeks ago, and actually we did a big piece on this because, I spoke to lots of different countries about their opinions, and then it showed that, the Germans wouldn't be on board. The Baltic states were nervous because it will take away troops from their countries, and Britain and France obviously are prepared to do it. But of course, you need Russia to agree. And we heard from Sergei Lavrov today, actually, after those talks, that Russia at the moment is not accepting the idea of NATO troops on the ground, but also a European Union-led force or any countries that are in NATO being involved in that peacekeeping force. So obviously there's got to be some, something done about that. They've got to be able to persuade the Russians that they will need to have some form of peacekeeping force in the country. And one thing that we've been looking at today is, could actually the UK provide something else other than boots on the ground? Because there's another huge concern in Europe that actually we haven't got enough forces to deploy to Ukraine.
Yes.
We've already got our forces tied up in the Baltic states. Do we have 20,000 troops to send? Actually, we might not. And so could we provide something else, like some aircraft or some technological expertise that could try and police the situation? So all those discussions are obviously ongoing at the moment, and it's all still to be worked out.
Right, and I completely get this is entirely hypothetical, but as you sort of game it out in your mind, is it conceivable that we could end up with, I say could, underline it could end up with some sort of Ukrainian boots on the ground at their own front line, frozen front line, with air cover provided by Britain and others, without others coming in, as Russia say they won't accept? Is that conceivable?
I think as long as there is some sort of deterrent for Putin, i.e. there are, genuinely aircraft patrolling the skies or aircraft ready to be scrambled in case the Russians try anything, then perhaps. But I think that probably President Zelensky, who said that he actually wants 110,000 boots on the ground, isn't going to be happy with Ukrainian troops plus aircraft policing the skies. And I think probably what is actually going to be more likely in the end is we'll agree to some sort of UN force, because that would probably be more palatable to Russia, because you could end up with troops from, countries like Bangladesh or even China involved in that.
Yes.
Whereas, Britain and France wouldn't be playing a leading part. And of course, this would be more like, a peacekeeping mission rather than like a deterrence force made up by Britain and France.
That's really interesting, Larissa. I mean, it would need to be a strong force, wouldn't it? We've seen in southern Lebanon, for example, the UN have peacekeepers deployed there, and they've just been swept aside as and when, the aggressors wanted to.
They've had a really difficult task in southern Lebanon. I mean, there were lots of exchanges of gunfire. They were really under threat there, but they did actually hold their nerve, and they did manage to stay there throughout large parts of the conflict. And actually, one other concern just to raise as well is someone was telling me that the UN is sort of short of peacekeeping troops at the moment, so it actually could be quite difficult to mount a huge force. But you'd need a smaller UN peacekeeping force patrolling those borders than you would need a European force, I'm told. So it would potentially be easier than sending 110,000 troops from Europe. And actually, Zelensky's asked for 110,000 troops. It wouldn't have to be that. It'd have to be treble that, because you'd need the forces to be able to rotate in and out.
Yes.
And 300,000 troops from Europe is a huge, huge number.
Indeed. I mean, look, last question. Look, circumstances have changed. They change seemingly every 24 hours or so. But you talk to military commanders the entire time. Are you picking up from them that they feel now they're winning the argument in favour of a much stronger defence force for this country, a bigger European defence force?
No, John, I'm not really. I'm sort of hearing that. We are going to have this pathway set out to hit 2.5%.
Yeah.
John Healey was asked about that this morning, and he said that it will be set out in the spring. So that's not earlier than they said a few months ago, despite all of this pressure. And the military chiefs, well, actually, one person was telling me today that 2.65%, so an increase from that 2.5% new target, would actually only enable them to just keep the big defence projects going. So even if we went above 2.5%, we still wouldn't see a huge modernisation of the military without cutting some big things.
Well, and you just don't see it.
Which, I mean, that's extraordinary, isn't it? That, even all of these threats that we're facing, people genuinely believe that we should be in this sort of wartime mentality. But actually, we haven't got the money in the Ministry of Defence to modernise our equipment or get any of the troops battle ready.